Welcome to Leadership Matters, a podcast from the Bailey Group. I'm your host, Kaylee Thompson, president of and partner at the Bailey Group, where we believe better leaders create healthier workplace environments, healthier humans, and a better world. On this show, we explore real stories, practical insights, and honest conversations to help you lead yourself and others better. Thanks for joining us. Let's dive in. Welcome to Leadership Matters. In today's episode, we're talking with Jim Willenbring, Senior Executive Coach and Consultant and one of my business partners at the Bailey Group. Jim brings over 30 years of experience working for Medtronic, starting his career as a field engineer, then rising through the ranks to eventually serve at the senior leadership levels for over a decade. Eventually, Jim made the leap into the world of executive coaching and leadership development more formally when he started his own practice. In today's episode, we talk about artificial intelligence and its impact on the world of leadership development, and also dive into personal stories from his experience coaching leaders at multiple levels of different organizations. Thanks for joining us. So let's start with your early experiences. Give us a sense for what early experiences had an impact on your leadership and your what leadership has meant to you.
Right. I've had a long career, which has been great, and I've had a number of leaders who, at the time, I didn't necessarily realize I was learning from really good leaders, but as I look back on it, they were actually really critical, I would say, in my definition of what a great leader is. And the first one was I was a field engineer, so I was in our commercial organization in a large medical device company, and in our field organization as well. And I worked with our sales folks and our customers, physicians, nurses at hospitals. And this district manager that I reported to essentially epitomized, I would call it, customer intimacy. It was really about understanding what the customer really needed, and making sure that we met and exceeded kind of those expectations. And so the piece of it for me that I learned from him was around listening. Around listening to understand what are they trying to accomplish, and not just, hey, I want this, but making sure you understand kind of the bigger picture of what they're trying to do, and then trying to over deliver on that, right, as well. And he was really he was a kind person as well, but he was also had really high expectations at the same time, right? I was relatively new in the job, and I had made a mistake at a hospital, right? Didn't have the right product available for them.
You made a mistake, Jim?
I made a mistake, that's right. And the surgeon who needed that product essentially called this manager up and essentially asked him to fire me.
Oh my gosh.
I know.
How terrifying.
I know it was. It was, and here I was, probably 9 months into the job,
Yes.
relatively early in my career,
Sure.
And he essentially just modeled to me where he put his metaphorical football helmet on, kind of went in, and essentially spoke with that customer to really understand, that physician to really understand what was the problem, what was the challenge, how could we essentially do service recovery for that. But then one of the things that he did is he also shared what my intent was, right? And what I was trying to do, right? And so he not only tried to really listen to the customer, but he also and really solve the problem, but also he also supported me as part of it as well.
Wow.
And then we went into a learning loop. Okay, what did I learn from this,
Yeah.
right? What would I do differently next time?
Yes.
How might have I anticipated this beforehand and had a couple of options available for them, those kinds of things. And so that was I had some fear, right, about was my
Sure.
job at risk? This was an important customer, that piece of it, and he had my back, but he also had high expectations around learning for me as well.
That's amazing. I love the embracing of mistakes and the reframing,
Right.
that those can be a really powerful opportunity to not only gain trust with your leader and work more collaboratively and better together and learn and grow yourself, but also to gain trust with the client and to approach that with curiosity and also with some assertiveness in regards to let me help you understand our perspective.
Yeah.
And my goodness, my stomach dropped when you talked about a mistake early in your career because, gosh, we've all been there, right?
Right. And I think there's this famous story from some leader at GE who made this massive mistake and it cost millions of dollars, right? From an overall business perspective, right? And he tendered his resignation, to his boss, and his boss gave it back to him and said, "I just spent $5 million on your development, okay? And so let's make it worth it."
Yes.
That's the thing, right?
Yes.
That piece of it. So
I love that story. That's a great illustration of mistakes are really truly only fatal if you don't learn from them.
yeah. The other example that I had that was really helpful for me is a little later in my career. I was in a marketing role, but I was hired into this job by a really wonderful manager and leader. And what I learned from him is he did a really good job in hiring people who had skills that he didn't.
Mm.
Versus someone who is the subject matter expertise for the area and is that go-to person. He said, "Why do I need to duplicate myself?" Right? That was his attitude. And so he would hire, people who brought in skills that he didn't know, specifically around what those skills were. But what he became, or how I saw him perform, was as the subject matter expert around managing and leading,
Mhm.
as opposed to the details of the job and the specifics of the job. So we had such a diverse kind of group of people in skills, knowledge, and so it made for some very lively kind of discussions, right? And that piece of it, but from that kind of experience, I really got a really strong sense for the value that different skills and abilities bring to an organization when they come together.
Mhm.
And one of the roles of a leader, right, is not just to hire people who are like themselves,
Right.
but to hire people who are outside of that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And my goodness, to your point, can that really stretch you and stretch the organization?
correct.
It introduces complexity, different dynamics, different perspectives, healthy tension.
Yeah. And it also, but actually also takes down the competition too,
Yeah.
in the sense of there was kind of known, I don't want to call it swim lanes, but known areas of
Sure.
competence and expertise, that people were known for,
Yeah.
and you could tap into, and so it actually increased the collaboration
Interesting.
and the work that we did together, which was right, which was really, the connections that I had, with some of those teammates at that point in time. I could call any of them up right now,
Yeah.
and it would be a wonderful reunion, and it actually needs to do that. But it's the kind of thing that was a really unique experience. I would say, unfortunately, because sometimes other leaders that I worked for didn't necessarily hire that way.
Sure.
But there were others who followed some of that philosophy as well.
So, what was your swim lane, Jim? Give us a sense for.
So my swim lane was, from that experience out in the field.
Ah,
I had come in essentially having worked on the front lines, with our customers and with our field organization, and so I knew what the practical realities were of that. I didn't have as much formal marketing experience and
mm,
training, where other people brought that. They had their MBAs from some business schools and were emphasized on the marketing side of things. And then I brought that true understanding of kind of what those needs are and what that reality was in how the products were used and the benefits they had.
sure.
Yeah.
So, you've worked with great leaders. Um, Give us some examples of leaders that maybe are less skilled, less effective. What are the attributes that really hold leaders back? Either that you've worked for as a team member or that you've coached. I know that you've coached extensively leaders at all different levels of organizations.
One of the common characteristics that I've seen in developing leaders is that invitation to shift, actually, from I am a subject matter expert in my specific area to I am a developer of subject matter experts in
Mm,
this area. Because that first kind of mindset and frame is one where they believe that they have to answer everything and they have to take on most of the work, and they're more of that doing piece of it versus thinking about how can I really accelerate the development of people on my team, to be able to be as good as or even better than I was, going forward, right? Because and actually the interesting thing is actually seeing that as part of their identity
Yeah.
and seeing that at the end of a day, I didn't necessarily get all this project work done, but I actually helped level up. As we talk about at the Bailey Group,
Yeah.
there's an opportunity to be able to level up, right? I leveled up folks on my team so that they can actually do something more independently. They don't
Mhm.
need as much direction anymore because all of a sudden their competence went up a level. Their effectiveness went up a level. Their knowledge and understanding and behaviors went up a level.
You talked about that transition of being the subject matter expert, the doer, or we call, the individual contributor, a lot of times is inside baseball talk for that, to being a leader of people and bringing out the best in people and not being that person. You touched on identity a little bit. Talk about why that transition is so hard for leaders, because we see it all the time.
Right. I think that the transition is so hard for leaders because how did they get to that role, right?
Mm.
How did they get promoted? It's often because of what they accomplished
Yeah.
previously, right? And I think of the mindset and the point of view that they look at themselves, and we all kind of have these successes that we feel good about and that are almost part of our natural hero's journey, right? That we accomplish these things, we were faced with these kind of challenges in our careers and we succeeded, right? That element, and we failed sometimes as well, but we learned from those, right? And what is that hero's journey of a leader as opposed to that individual contributor, right? Because
Mhm.
it's so much easier for people to say, I, as an engineer, I helped, design and develop this product, right? As a marketer, I helped launch this program, right? All whatever your function or role is, right? I think it's really easy to see kind of how you have an impact around the business of the business, right?
Mhm.
And what they produce. But I think those stories and those experiences around, I essentially helped my team and my organization develop a really effective strategy, right? Or
Mhm.
I helped to hire the right people. I helped develop them in their roles, right? I helped them be able to make much more effective decisions, right? Um, some of those skills around, what managers and leaders can do, to be able to kind of get work done, I think what's so difficult about that is it's a really different way of kind of valuing yourself and your work
Mhm.
going forward.
So how do you coach leaders through that, Jim?
I think one of the classic skills is delegation, right? And I think delegating as a first line manager, versus second line, third line, go all the way up, is a really necessary and effective skill. It changes over that time based on where you are in the organization. But I think that element around delegation, I think, is that's one example of a critical skill. So how you do that? So here's a really interesting story of a client that I was coaching. Commercial leader, had kind of field facing folks and then some other marketing folks, and he was complaining that his team wasn't showing initiative.
Mm.
It felt like there was so much work on his shoulders that he
Mm.
was trying to do. People weren't coming up with ideas. They weren't showing initiative. They would take actions and complete the work. But they weren't doing that. And he we were exploring some different ideas, and I was asking him some questions and having some thoughts in my head around how much oxygen is he creating, right, for
Mhm.
his team to breathe in and be able to kind of step into that space. And so I asked a question. I said, um, with your regular team meetings, that you have every 2 weeks, what percentage of the time are you talking?
Mm.
Okay. And that was one of those questions that, is a classic, powerful question
Mm.
because he realized, sheepishly, right? He said, I'm talking 80% of the time
Wow.
during my team meetings. And I let that simmer a little bit, right? Left that space, right, with him. And then of course he realizes that's kind of the problem, right? And so the homework then that I proposed for him was to say, for your next team meeting, what would need to be true for you to flip that so
Mm.
that you're talking 20% of the time? Okay. You can imagine his reaction.
That's big.
I know. I don't know if I can do that,
That's a
right?
huge shift.
Right, but it's not 80 to 70 or
Yeah.
60, right? To me, the stretch was something so meaningful that he had to change structure. He had to think, I can't just carve the edges off or ask, people, what more do you have to say, right? Or how can you contribute here more? He had to really think differently about it. And so we brainstormed about what are some different solutions for that, right? And then I asked him, well, how do you systematize it going forward, right? And so he ended up actually delegating running the meeting,
Nice.
to someone else, and he supported that person.
Mm-hmm.
And then he would carve off chunks of it and say, you've got responsibility for that piece. You've got responsibility for the other one. He'd rotate that through, but he started to create this structure. And so that he would participate in that and do a little bit of the planning and supporting of them, but they would be running those pieces and sections, and then he was able to kind of shift whole chunks of those to those elements.
Wow.
And his team members were really uncertain because they hadn't done it before as well.
Sure.
But similarly uncertain, just like he was, about how do I shift that going forward. So that was just one example of delegating and creating space, right? For people to step up into what he probably thought of as some of his primary responsibilities.
Mm-hmm.
But if you think about that, his primary responsibility was really to level up his team.
Right.
And some of those skills would be as to how do you run those team meetings, right? And how do you have those skills to be able to come in with an agenda, to be able to be really crisp, to have defined outcomes you want to accomplish, and then how do you facilitate those conversations going through that, right?
Jim, you talked about how critical the skill of delegation is for people to truly level up. And I know there have certainly been times in my career where that is very relatable. What gets in the way of people truly being able to effectively delegate? You talked about some awareness there. What else gets in people's way?
I think one of the things that gets in people's way for delegation is not defining what are the decisions that I should own at my leader level and what decisions should other people own at their levels, right? And I think there's the classic, for the decisions that need to be made and the work that needs to happen, there's the classic, I think it's called the Eisenhower kind of 2x2 matrix, which is, importance and urgency. Right? Those are the two axes, right? And all too often the column that's the urgency column, succumbs to the tyranny of the urgent, right? Even if it's not important or highly important, right? And so I think leaders like to whack the mole. They like to do the elements that can really be responsive, right, to their team, to their customers, to whoever their stakeholders are. And I think that that gives you that short-term kind of burst of dopamine and accomplishment, right? And we all like to check things off often on our lists, right? But I think that the question I think really gets to is for our leaders to ask themselves the question, who should be making this decision, right? And at what level? And is it me, or can I delegate that to someone else on my team? And if they may not be ready, what would need to be true for that to happen, right? What knowledge, what skills, how could they in their development, get to a point where they can start making those decisions and developing that? I had a client who was essentially thinking about, he was in that situation where he was essentially spending 80% of the time talking during his meetings as well. And this was a model that, I've seen a few times, right? So we did the flip, right? The 80-20 piece of it. And so the really interesting conversation I had with him was, where's the most important area for the business where you need to be spending more and more time on that you've not been able to get to because all of the urgent elements have been kind of calling upon you.
And where was that? Give us a sense for where is that for leaders?
For this leader, it was around, innovation, was around the area where how do we help grow our business going forward? And how do we identify what those opportunities are? And I asked him, what are you in the organization uniquely qualified to do more than anybody else?
It's a scary question.
Right. 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 And he said, he said that was that space,
Mm.
right? To really help drive the strategy about where they can help grow going
Mm-hmm.
forward. And so there's that element for him was really motivational,
Mm.
and was really exciting for him. And so instead of and so there was a pull, there was a gravity that was kind of pulling him there. But for him, he was always feeling dissatisfied or actually less than and
Yeah.
unaccomplished because he never had time to do it.
Right.
And so when we established that as a goal for him, that opportunity to be able to delegate became a lot more clear,
Sure.
right? And when he started putting that filter on his eyes and the decisions that he was making around, am I uniquely qualified to be doing this work? And if the answer is no, then I think that
It
was
changes everything.
right, exactly. And then then the invitation is how can I have my team member do that, or
Yeah.
or how can I develop my team member to be able to do that, in 2 or 3 months.
That's brilliant. And best case scenario with that gravitational pull, that why being so empowering for him.
Hmm.
So often, I know I've seen leaders feeling that gravitational pull the opposite direction. Well, if I give this up, then I have to stretch into new areas that I've never stretched before. I don't know if I can do it. I know I can do that. I know I can do the accounting work, or I know I can do the engineering work. That's scary. How do you help leaders with that?
Helping leaders with the scary, I think, is the connection to, uh, I would say, purpose, to values, to operating at the top of their license. I know you have a version of that. What's your version, Kaylee?
Highest and best use.
That's the good one. So when you are able to do that highest and best use of your talents and skills, right? Uh, I think that space, on one hand, is motivating, right? But also can be scary, right?
Mhm.
There's a quote that I like to say, which is, "How do you know your boundaries unless you cross them?"
Mm.
There's always boundaries you don't want to cross, kind of from an ethics perspective. But when a growth and development kind of framework and
Yeah.
perspective, the boundary is kind of where I'm comfortable.
Mhm.
And stepping into that uncomfortable, I think is when I think about my own career. I think that was a lesson I learned early on, is to volunteer for the things that they need some help with that you don't necessarily know how, but you can be helpful for, right?
Mhm.
And raising your hand, for those examples, saying, "Well, I haven't done it, but maybe I've done some similar things, but I know this is going to be a really interesting learning experience,"
Mhm.
right? And so that stretch, I think is really really helpful. The other concept that I talk to about people with is, people have this concept in them around authenticity, right? And one of the things I challenge them on is that authenticity is not static.
Mm.
Just like, if you think you stretch your arms out really wide, right? That pull, if you're pulling those arms out further and further, right? The center of you pulls as
Yeah.
well, right? And so as you stretch, it's a really helpful metaphor. As you kind of stretch your arms out, right? The areas where you haven't had experience yet, there's also can be a pull internally where your authenticity gets bigger,
Mm.
and there's more range, right, that you have, and more agility,
Yeah.
right, to be authentic in more spaces or in more ways, right? And so that kind of changes people. Maybe, I don't know if it's the exact Carol Dweck kind of fixed mindset versus the growth mindset piece of it, but it's kind of in that same camp, right? Where sometimes people feel like, this is me, this is my identity, and this is me being authentic. And yeah, and that there's a kernel there, there's a root there, but how can your authenticity be stretched and grow as well? I think opens, I think, some opportunity in people's minds and challenges them in a good way.
I love that visual, Jim. It reminds me of I did the CTI coaching fundamentals training a couple weeks ago, and they did this brilliant exercise that maybe you did as well, where they spotlighted one person. There's 18 of us in this cohort, and they spotlight one person, and people, this is the last day of the training. You've had 2.5 days with these folks, and people talk about what they observe from you,
Mhm.
poise, professionalism, planful. And then on the flip side, they flip it and say, what do you want to see more of out of this person?
Mm.
And you get a lot of, you know, um, opposite words coming up. chaotic energy, wild, spontaneous. You can imagine some of this comes from my own personal experience. And then you name, what's a visual for that? A wild cat or Miley Cyrus or some sort of, visual that demonstrates that. And then we practice coaching from that figure or coaching from that mentality. And the point of the exercise was to show that exists inside you.
Mm-hmm.
How can you turn the dial up on that?
Right. How do you invite it in? How do you
Yes.
open it up? Right.
Stretch the authenticity.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that exercise, and I remember a similar one that I had gone through back then. And I just remember my part of my identity, for me was not Jim or James, was J, a single initial J with a leather jacket. you know, kind of a biker J kind of thing, which is not my personality, right? But what did that open up in me?
Right.
Right. And what did that invite me to? That was outside my comfort zone, but could be in service to the team I'm leading,
Yeah.
to the person I'm coaching,
Mhm.
that element of it. And I think that whole idea around helping people see themselves, okay, and also then help see the box that they put around themselves,
Mm.
right?
Mhm.
And I think at the Bailey Group, we self-awareness and awareness, I think, is so critical to how we approach the work that we do with our clients, right? And helping leaders become aware of where are their strengths, right? Where are their derailers, right? What are their values? And understand that, right? And then once you have that's not a static box, right?
Right.
But how can they, knowing that, how can they use that to stretch themselves going
Mm.
forward, right? So I think that's the gift of leadership development and coaching work, right? Is to be that candid, honest, and supportive, right? Partner, in that journey for somebody,
Mhm.
and really, really help them embrace kind of where they are now, and then reach for who they want to be.
Mm. I love that.
So,
Last week we had Anne on the podcast, and we talked about how the concept of executive coaching, for those that don't operate in the space or maybe haven't had the opportunity to work with an executive coach, can seem a little bit mysterious. What is executive coaching, Jim?
executive coaching, as we practice it at the Bailey Group, is, I would call it a tailored, customized kind of identification of what's the problem, what's the opportunity, what's the stretch, what's the need.
Mm.
So there's an early phase of that really helps in this intersection. I think of the Venn diagrams, right? That overlap with each other. Is what are the development needs for the leader,
Mm.
right? What are the needs of the organization, right? And how do when you have those two circles that overlap, what's in that middle, that they're really excited to work on as an individual,
Mhm.
and the organization would find that incredibly valuable, for them to level up kind of those skills, right? And so,
Ah.
so I think there's this, what I would call it is that lesson that I talked about earlier about customer intimacy as
Mhm.
a critical. We think about it, I think, as understanding kind of what their needs are,
Mhm.
and then crafting an approach, right? Whether that's for an individual at whatever kind of level in the organization, from the top, all the way down to those other senior levels of leadership in the organization, and essentially crafting an approach, right, to identify what is the need, and then how can we address that need, right, with a number of different approaches, right, and then the other two skills that we bring to the table are essentially a really strong understanding around behavioral science, that we can apply, to kind of human beings, right, combined with business acumen.
Mhm.
All of us who do coaching at the Bailey Group have sat in the chair, if you want to use that term. And that sitting in the chair, and that chair might vary a little bit. We have, are coaches who have been CEOs and very senior leaders at large organizations, at smaller organizations, right? They've led technical functions, they've led marketing areas, they've had legal experience. So we have a wonderful kind of breadth of people who have different experiences and different really, really deep kind of business acumen in different areas that bring that perspective so that they're not, always giving people answers, right? But what they're doing is they're leveraging that experience to really help them, I would say, bring the right frameworks and the right thinking to the table, and asking the right powerful questions, for those individuals. And it's a combination that's a really synergistic one that really accelerates their development really quickly.
Why are both of those ingredients so critical, Jim?
Both of the ingredients between, I would call it the behavioral science and the business acumen, that ability, I would say, to have fundamentally strong coaching skills that are really grounded in how human beings, right, and adults and leaders essentially grow and develop kind of new skills. It's really about the just like an engineer needs to learn some of the fundamentals around materials and electricity and whatever they're kind of specializing in. Those are the fundamentals around how around human beings learn and develop and grow, right? So I think understanding some of those fundamental behavioral science elements is a bit of the how,
Mm,
um, that in how people do things, and I think the benefit then of the business acumen piece of it is really the context and the why.
mm,
The connection of those skills to their work, to their context, to what the organization is trying to accomplish, and that ability to be able to bring in somebody who's got that strong seasoning, and strong experience, can be really, really incredible to, I would call it, accelerate some of that impact. And so I think that's the difference, right? Is that you have somebody who could come in really with almost no specific business acumen, but be very well trained as a coach, right? Um, or you have somebody who comes in as a very strong business experience, but they don't have a lot of the kind of behavioral science side of things.
mhm,
Um, I think both of those are gonna, may be helpful, but they're probably not going to be as helpful as quickly,
mm,
and potentially have as big of an impact
mm.
on those leaders.
That's great. You're a techie guy, Jim.
I am a ticket guy.
So artificial intelligence is everywhere. It's taking over the world, according to some. What do you see as the future of leadership development with artificial intelligence? And does artificial intelligence have the capacity, the capability to take over coaching?
That's a existential question, isn't it?
How
Right?
much time do we have?
Right. I, the short answer to that question, I believe, is no. But let's peel it back and dive into it. I think AI can play, I would say, a very strong supportive role.
Mm,
I would say surrounding coaching. Um, Whether it's the administrative side of coaching, whether it's the how can I pull some resources together on
mm,
specific topics that
mhm,
might be really helpful, right? For the client, related to a specific kind of area, right, that they're working on. Um, you can imagine, they have some already some coaching, chatbots, right, and other kind of tools and techniques, that can, I would say, emulate, a human being on the other end and ask some questions and help someone clarify some things in their mind. So I think AI can be helpful, I think, in some of those spaces. I think the area where uh, the humanness of coaching is, I would say, essential and critical, is 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 really around the emotional element of coaching, right? And let me explain that a little bit further.
yeah.
The emotional element of coaching, when you think about it, one of those primary emotions is around motivation, right? And that ability to be able to sense whether something is landing with someone, right?
Mm,
Whether something is challenging with someone, whether whether there's an emotional lift or reaction to maybe some dawning realization of them around themselves, right? Uh, and holding the space for that, to actually create the space for them to be able to lean into some of that self-reflection, um, and lean into some of the, and be okay with and be able to experience some of those emotions, right? Which is part of being human, right? You know, this is not as much relevant today, but maybe there's some workplaces out there that might say, leave your emotions at the door when you come into work, right? Or manage those emotions really strongly. Um, do they want unmotivated people at their workplace? Because motivation, right? Essentially is emotionally related, and so I think part of the, I would say, the humanness element of coaching is that interconnection with them as a human being, right?
Mm.
That ability to be able to invite and sense, when someone's responding really well, um, or when someone's troubled, right? Or when they're experiencing some realization, right? That's really important and critical. And how do you create that space for that to happen, and how do you support it when it does? And then at the end of it, um, how can that person then harness those emotions, right?
Mm.
And those insights, from that experience, right, towards action, right? So I think the AI piece of it, at least not in the short to medium term, who knows what's going to happen, maybe many years from now. Um, but I think there's a gift, I would say, that we bring to coaching, and good coaches bring to their clients around that connection with someone.
Mm.
And and as AI takes on more and more work and more importance, the humanness of work becomes even more important, because I think that's what a lot of people kind of get motivated from, right? Is that connection with others. Not everybody, but a lot of people do, right? There's the lone novelist kind of writing, their work by themselves, but they're working with their editor, and that piece of it. It's pretty rare to find somebody who's really out, truly on an island, kind of doing their work, right? It's really that connection with others.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And both Lee and Barb, when they had them on the podcast individually, talked about this human need to feel seen
Mm-hmm.
and valued.
Right. Yep.
And I just don't know how you design AI well enough for the mirror neurons in my brain to feel truly seen and valued
Right.
by a piece of technology.
Right. And that what are the contributors to being seen, right? And when I think of those, it's somebody who's approaching them with curiosity. It's somebody who is willing to hear the good and the bad, right? And someone who is essentially is caring, right? There's they feel that, right?
Mm.
They feel that peace, and what that contributes then is trust, right? So then they can be more open, they can be more candid, they can share their fears, right? They can share where they're not feeling enough, right? And we all have that. We all do, and whether we share it or not, or whom we share it with, right? But that level of trust, right, with someone where you can talk about some of the challenges that you're working on at work, and do that in a safe environment. Unfortunately, sometimes that's hard to find,
Mm.
right? And I think that's a unique place that a good coach can bring some of that to the table. Um, allow them to be vulnerable, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then be able to be with that, right? And then work through it.
Yeah, you talked about the drivers of trust. And, I just come back to how important empathy and compassion are.
Right.
And it reminds me, you talked earlier about how we've got individuals who coach that have sat in the seat. And my goodness, I'm brought back to a time last year when it was a hard season for me. And I remember talking with a coach on the phone, and he didn't try to fix it.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't try to reassure me everything was going to be okay. He just acknowledged
Mm-hmm.
this is hard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a superpower, is acknowledgement. Which is I think you may have defined it here, in what you were saying before, which is that somebody feels like, like they're seen, at some really important part of themselves, right? Um, and when you experience that, there's appreciation, there's kind of, and then there's acknowledgement, right? And there's a big emotional step between that, where somebody it just rings inside of them, and so that space, I think, that coaches can hold, and invite, clients to actually not just get that acknowledgement from someone else, but even more importantly, to acknowledge themselves. I think is another big opportunity for people, and for people to feel motivated, right? Because if you're only getting motivated externally, working on those opportunities, for individuals to feel competent and confident, right? And then and be able to tap into the sage inside of them, as opposed to the saboteurs and the judges, and then be able to manage those voices that we all have inside of us, right? In ways that can be productive, as opposed to really put doubt, and really cause people to not show up in ways that are really helpful for themselves and their team and their business. Yeah.
Yeah, it occurs to me as we talk about growth and development, so much of it is a willingness and a resilience to go into uncharted territories. And sitting in a space with somebody who's also been in uncharted territories and maybe has survived those uncharted territories, and know in their bones that you're going to survive this, even if you don't know if you're going to or not. There's power in that. It normalizes the experience
Yeah.
that you're experiencing for the first time, and your brain isn't sure, am I going to survive this or not?
And what is surviving, right? And I think there's a reframing sometimes that you can do, which is, well, I get through it, versus I get through it and I learn from it, or I don't get through it and I learn and I learn
Yeah.
from that as well, or I don't get through it and I don't learn, right? I
Yeah.
guess that's the other one, and so I think surviving and thriving are really interesting words. They sound alike, right? And I think the differences between those two can be really, it can be a mindset kind of shift. If you take that learner's mindset, right, and you look at, we're all going to have some challenges, we're all going to have some issues in the world, or we're not going to succeed in everything, but can we be successful in learning from everything, or as much as we can? I think that's there's there was a podcast about, about that kind of learner's mindset. Is I may have gotten a 3 out of 10 in whatever action that I've been doing here recently, but can I get a 10 out of 10 in learning from that kind of action? And so that intention around, can I do the best I can to learn from the mistakes that I made?
Yeah.
Can be a really interesting way to kind of look at things.
Yeah. And for the achievers out there, man, that's motivating.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I love that. So, Jim,
Mm,
you became a partner in TVG.
I did.
What an experience that's been, huh?
That has been quite an experience.
We had Ann on the podcast last week, and we laughed about some of the ups and the downs and the unforeseen hiccups, I guess, along the way, and could look back with gratitude for where we're at now, and how we certainly can empathize more with clients going through similar transitions, and you don't know what you don't know.
Right.
So I'd love to hear from you. First, how did the Bailey Group come on your radar? And then why did you want to jump in with both feet?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was in my own private practice, essentially, doing coaching and strategy consulting kind of work. And Ann Hauser, okay, who, she
Friend of the podcast.
That's right. That's right. So Anne is the penultimate connector, I think, and connecting
Yes.
people and different opportunities and such.
That she is.
And so she essentially had reached out to me, and our work circle had crossed, in our prior job, when we were working at Medtronic, and she said, "Hey, the Bailey Group is looking for some contract coaches, and so would you be interested?" And so she connected me to the Bailey Group essentially that way. And so I had conversations with Lee and with Barb and a few others, as I came in. And so I came in as a contract coach, and it was fun to have some people that I knew. Essentially there was another coach that joined a little later who used to be my HR business partner, in a prior job as well. So it seemed like
Who is that?
it's like Victor. Yeah. So
I didn't realize that you
Yeah.
guys worked that closely together.
Right. It just seemed like a small world and a little microcosm, right?
Yeah.
Of different circles that I had traversed, right, in my prior career in life, and people that I had really enjoyed working with.
I will say, one of the things I've learned, and I grew up in Fargo, North Dakota, smaller town than Minneapolis. It is a very small world, especially when you get into the Twin Cities and the leadership development space. It's amazing.
Right.
You're really only half a degree of separation from people.
Right. And so that experience essentially, was a really good one to not just, interact and get connected to and do some really good coaching right through the Bailey Group, but I would call it, one of the characteristics of the culture of the Bailey Group is really, kind of belonging. And even with contractors, right, and people who essentially were doing some part-time work for the group or for the organization. And so that was fun to feel like I was joining a new team, where I was welcomed, right, and I felt, a part of that team, right, in addition to the private practice work that I was doing as well. And then I was approached as well to attend some of the quarterly business
Yeah,
reviews,
you were on our A team.
right, as an advisor, right,
Yeah.
and to kind of weigh in. And I can't count the number of quarterly business reviews that I've been in my career, and so I thought, this is an area that I've got experience in.
Yeah.
And I did a lot of work with business strategy, in my career, and I knew what effective QBRs were and the role they played in the organization, not in such a small organization, but more in a bigger one. And so I thought that was a really interesting kind of learning experience as well.
So take us back to that first QBR, Jim. You've had such extensive and diverse experience. What do you recall from that experience, your first QBR with the Bailey Group?
I came in trying to moderate my expectations because of big company, small company
Yeah.
kind of experiences.
Very small company.
Right. But I was actually very pleased with the foundation you had in place, right? You had a 1-year plan, a 3-year, a 7-year vision. I've got
3-year picture, you got it?
Sure, there we go. Right. And so there was a roadmap.
Yeah.
And there were investments identified, right? And there was, I would call it the strategy was being operationalized, right, and translated, from the bigger picture, and the medium to long term time frame to how do we do this next year version of that going forward, which I thought was, So I was, I didn't know what to expect in a small company. Sometimes it's a little more informal, but I thought, hey, here's an operating system that's working and running and in place, and it's got the fundamentals, that feel both helpful and necessary and appropriate, for any business to have and such. So I was learning actually to see what could get translated from, I would say, a bigger company experience down to a small company, and what are those core essentials. And so that was a fascinating experience.
And you were blown away by the facilitation, I'm sure.
Absolutely. That's right. That's right. So, and I think there's also an element of good enough. Sometimes, for QBRs that I was familiar with, you could have teams working for really, significant kind of pitches and changes in strategy and direction, and, working on some of this stuff for weeks and weeks and weeks or months, right? To bring some of these programs and projects together, because you've got a really large organization. And this was really around what it helped bring me to a good realization is what good enough is
Mm.
for a company, that is on the small side of things, right? And what's necessary and essential, and what might be overkill or not affordable from a
Mhm.
time perspective,
Mm.
right? To be able to do and be able to make those decisions fairly quickly as well.
Mhm.
So, yeah.
Yeah, I remember your participation at our QBRs was so valuable. I talked with Ann about this as well. And for you specifically, Jim, I just remember, and I don't know if you remember this or not, but I approached you afterwards and said to you, I really appreciated your approach in those QBRs because you would push us, you would offer alternative perspectives, you would ask, powerful questions, your favorite. And you did so in such an open-handed way. There was no attachment towards, "This is my decision, and this is the decision that I wanna try to influence all of you to believe."
Right.
And that, I think, really elevated the conversation in really powerful ways.
Thank you. Um, one of the I've had a lot of experiences running advisory boards in my career, and one of the lessons I learned from that uh, is that the convener, right? The organization, the business or whoever is essentially sponsoring the advisory board, you know, um, their job is to bring ideas in, right? But they get to make the decision,
Mm.
and the best participants on advisory boards are ones who um who again offer their expertise, offer some ideas, but they don't hold on to them
Yeah.
tightly,
Good.
right? Because that's not their role, that's not their
Yeah.
job, right? And so to me that helps actually support clarity in decision making,
Mm.
and doesn't get too messy and mixed up, and then the emotions get involved related to, well, why didn't you follow what I was recommending? Well, your role is to advise,
Yeah.
and the others is to decide
Yeah.
that element of it. So
That decision-making clarity is so
it
healthy.
that's right. It's very clear, and and actually, if you manage those expectations up front, that's
Right.
so much easier and better to do that as opposed to at the end,
Mm.
when someone had a different expectation
Mhm.
around kind of what someone was going to do with their advice and feedback.
Yeah.
hmm
That's good.
And I think that's when you think about it, at the essence of coaching, who gets to choose? The client does at the
Right.
end of the day, that leader, right? And the role that we play is to try to have some transparency around and expansion around those choices in front of them,
Mm.
right? And help them fill that in. And then the opportunity for them is to make a conscious, resonant choice.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's really good.
Yeah.
So you talked about the culture of the Bailey Group
hmm
attracted you.
hmm
How would you describe the culture of the Bailey Group for those that haven't swam around in it?
Yeah, I would describe the internal culture of the
Yes.
Bailey Group, which I think shows up in how we show up to our clients, right? But is a little louder internally, right? Right, and more visible. I would use words like welcoming.
Mm.
I would use words like strong sense of belonging or an invitation to belong, right?
Mm.
That piece of it, which is kind of like welcoming, right? Um, I would say voice, really encouraging people's voice. Um, we talked earlier about acknowledgement. I think there's appreciation and acknowledgement as well, and then there's deliberation. So I think there's there's a bias in a good way towards what do people really think,
Mm.
and and if it stays at the surface level, there's challenging but supportive questions to, as you can imagine, these are a bunch of people who have some really strong emotional intelligence skills, right, and listening skills.
We're a bunch of coaches.
That's right. And so if there's an elephant in the room,
Yeah.
guess what? It gets called out.
Yep.
It's get invited to show itself,
Yep.
and discussed, that piece of it, and emotions get acknowledged, right? I think in a way that is uncommon to see. Sometimes some teams and organizations will have a space for that, but I think uh, you know we throw ourselves strongly into our work and our roles, right? And I think the Bailey Group acknowledges the wholeness of us and how we show up, and
I love
creates some
that.
space for that. So
I love that.
yeah.
Thank you.
hmm
So you talked about your journey to coming to the Bailey
hmm
Group. You talked about your journey of joining the advisory team, the A team. Why'd you decide to become a partner?
Yeah, well, the opportunity arose, right? I think some number of us were exploring the interest, right? And for me, there was a point in which I hadn't necessarily had that as an idea for my next role or a big step right in my career and in my journey in my life. And so my initial reaction was a real strong resonance, right? It wasn't, oh, I'm not sure about this, I need to think about it, but there was something really positive that really resonated in me about it. And I think part of that had to do with this, I think, opportunity around scale of impact.
Mm,
Um, I worked a lot in my career around, helping drive innovation, in medical technology, right, and having an impact, on a big scale that you can have in a big company, right? And for the Bailey Group, there's a really interesting kind of flow down impact that the company can have, even at a small kind of scale, in the sense of the number of people that we have at the Bailey Group. um, I just thought, instead of just being a coach, which is a great role to have, that opportunity to really to help the organization think about the scale and impact that we can have more broadly, and really and more specifically, potentially in some cases, um, and I just saw that scale of impact opportunity, it really got big for me as an attractive element.
mm,
Um, because the work that we do with senior leaders in organizations can have an outsized effect, not just on that person, but on everybody in their organization,
and in their lives.
right? In their lives, in their company, and so uh, that flow down, right,
Hmm.
of impact, um, was really attractive for me. And the one-to-one kind of coaching I was doing, or some of the team development work I was doing, clearly is very valuable. But then thinking about how I can contribute to a company that does that work,
Mm,
right, was really motivating for me.
that's great.
Yeah.
So Ann and I compared battle scars through the learning process, the ups and the downs. Um, and sort of laughed about those last week as we talked about, man, we really had no idea what we were doing when we first entertained these conversations. And thank goodness, I just had to give a shout out to Anne's husband, Scott,
Yeah.
for he was the most experienced of the four of us in doing this. But this was a brand new time for me to increase my ownership at such a large scale. What lessons have you learned from that stretch? We talked earlier about growth requires exploring uncharted territories.
Yeah. I think the mechanics, right, of company succession, you know, really, there's a lot of it on the mechanics side of things, right, and the legal agreements and the negotiations, that is designed around if things go bad,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
And that's what the lawyers.
Worst case
Yeah,
scenario.
I love the lawyers, right? And that's their job, right?
Yes.
And so if you leave it at that, that's rough,
Yeah.
right? To sit in the if things go bad kind of
Oh, it's
thing.
a lot of exploring worst
Right.
case scenario.
Yes, right. And so one of the opportunities that we took, right, as part of through the process is, yes, we need to kind of get through those pieces, um but how can we have some of those opportunity conversations
Hmm.
around this, with Lee,
Hmm.
right, and us, to really have those discussions that are really generative and are on the plus side of the ledger,
Yeah.
for how things can go well,
Yeah.
right? And what are the benefits of this, and exploring some of those pieces. And so I think one of the lessons for me is to in those examples is to ask for both,
Mm,
right? And how can the process serve us, because I think we got to a point where it was we were serving the process, but there was some unmet needs in those conversations that were really helpful to have with Lee.
Yeah.
At strategic points in time. And he's such a wonderful individual, regardless, right?
And it was such a friendly transaction.
Yes.
I can't imagine a better group of humans to do the transaction with.
Correct.
And there were still sticky points along the way.
Yeah. And I think this actually connects back to, we talked about the culture of the Bailey Group, right? Is how do we honor who we are in the work that we do together with each other? And I think there's an element around we coach, right? And we bring some of those skills and capabilities to the table, and we apply those as we're talking about some of the cultural elements that I identified, that I see as part of the Bailey Group. But even in that transaction process, I think we were feeling like those elements weren't being honored, and we called them up, right? And we essentially created space for it, and we said, let's meet some needs that aren't being met here right now, and have those conversations, and that was wonderful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Hugely impactful. It does remind me of work in organizations as well, where at the end of the day, we're all on the same team.
Right.
We're all trying to create the most successful outcome for the organization.
Yep.
And I think so much gets missed when communication breaks down or there's silos. I talked to Anne about how I wish we would have had more conversations. We just got so busy after the transaction that heads down, let's go, go, go. It's kind of the tyranny of the urgent that we talked about earlier.
Right. And I think the one of the critical elements for how we set up coaching engagements is you do a lot of designing the alliance in the beginning.
Yeah.
Right.
And talked about that last week.
Right. And you create the space for what are those expectations, right? And when you don't know what you don't know, right? The unknown unknowns, it's hard to design that, right? Because you haven't gone through it. And so Scott's help was really helpful. And there's the human side of that transaction, right? That I think doesn't play, I think, as big of a role as it should. Both in acknowledging, Lee's, transition as well to founder, right? And our transitions right into leadership roles, at the Bailey Group as well. So the transactional pieces start to fade a little bit for me, and the humanist ones actually stay.
Yeah.
Those are the pieces that stick, right? And
Yeah.
and so I think, as others are thinking about succession, I think I'm trying to understand what do we want to honor as part of the work that we're doing together, I think is probably a really helpful and powerful question for people to ask themselves, and we want to honor the legal requirements, and we want to honor the negotiation kind of elements as well. But what else do you want to honor that's part of that's really critical and important and honors people's values?
You've said before, the path to meaningful change is paved with acts, not intention.
Yeah.
What do you mean by that?
Well, there clearly are some intentions there, but if it's left at intentions, meaningful change doesn't happen, right? And I think the model that I haven't, that I use right with clients, is really that leadership is expressed through behaviors and actions, right? And you start with some awareness, kind of where are my strengths, where are my weaknesses and derailers, right? You move to, well, what are some ways to address those, kind of the knowledge piece of it, right? And that's where training, can be helpful, right? But if it just sits there at knowledge, it often misses that opportunity, right, to actually get translated into action. And so what needs to happen next with behaviors is practice. Okay, practice with your coach, practice with your team, right? Practice with your manager, practice with your spouse, right? Because behaviors actually, they need the practice. There's a neuroscience element around kind of new behaviors, right? They need new neural connections, right? And that's how you reinforce those, right? Is through practice, right? And then with extended practice, that practice then shows up in behaviors as a leader, right? In the real world and in the wild, right? And then finally, if you're behaving certain ways, right, that are really effective, that turns into habits.
Yeah.
And then the exciting thing is if you get enough leaders demonstrating the same effective habits, that actually leads to culture change
Mm.
over time.
Mm.
And that can be really exciting because we can do some of that work with cohort work, right?
Mhm.
Where we may come in and help an individual, and then what they often will say is, what, I would love to help you level up my team with some of these same behaviors,
Mhm.
right? And then we can come in, and design something that really can help address them and change behaviors, and then change potentially culture, help
Mm.
them change culture. So
I love how you talk about that, translating to real meaningful culture change, which so many organizations are determining how best to do that. And I love how you point to turning knowledge into different ways of being, doing, thinking,
right.
and truthfully acting
Hmm.
at the end of the day.
That's right. So that's the pavement is actions, behaviors, right? Habits,
Yes.
and those are all really necessary, right, to actually get to change because otherwise it doesn't stick.
Right.
It's interesting, but not helpful.
Yeah. And it is amazing if everyone, if knowledge was the key to growth and success, everyone would grow and be successful. And the reality is, knowledge is only a piece of it. It really is.
Necessary, but not sufficient.
Yes. Love
So,
that.
yeah.
Jim, we do a lot of different leadership development modalities at the Bailey Group. You touched on cohort leadership development. We've talked about your experience advising CEOs and coaching different executives. We do succession planning. We do team development. What's the work that's most exciting to you in this season of life?
I believe is the work with individuals that are part of some group leader development work, right? So that there's both individual work that's happening for that leader, right? But and they are connected to others who are traveling down the same path or a similar path for them. And so there's both an individual nature to it, and then there's a collective nature to it,
Mm,
because that gets to some of the scale piece of it.
mm,
For me, it's a twofer. Working with individual clients is awesome. And then adding some icing on top of the awesomeness, right, is the opportunity, right, to be able to do similar work with some of their peers, so that because one of the magic as part of it is it can be self-reinforcing.
mm.
Right? They're going through it together. They can help hold accountability for each other and not just the coach or their manager or their
Sure.
organization. But I think there's so much power in their individual journeys, right, that are synchronized in certain ways that are self-reinforcing around their growth and development going forward. So I think it's that piece of it that's really motivating for me.
Maximizing your impact.
Right. That's one of my strengths from the Strengths Finders is a maximizer, right?
You and me both.
That's right. So it's showing up there.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's great.
Yeah.
Well, Jim, it's been such a pleasure having you on today.
Well, this has been a joy. I really love these conversations.
Yeah, me too. It's fun nerding out on some of the leadership development topics, and it's been great hearing more about your path and formative experiences that have made you into the leader and the coach you are today.
Yeah. Well, thank you. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for joining us for today's episode of Leadership Matters. If today's episode resonated with you, would you do me a favor and share it with someone you care about? To learn more about the work the Bailey Group is doing in the world, check us out at thebaileygroup.com or follow us over on LinkedIn. We love sharing useful articles, helpful resources, and valuable tools to help you expand your leadership capacity. Like and subscribe, and join us next time for more honest conversations.